The church is Christ's body in which he speaks and acts and by which he fills everything, including the White House, including government halls, including universities, including education centers, including the best medical labs, including the biggest businesses. He doesn't just fill our church business or our churches, he fills everything with his presence. How does he do that? He does that through you. He does that through me. Wherever I go, God rules. When I walk on White House grounds, God walks on White House grounds. When I walked in the river, God walked in the river. When I go into the dry cleaner, that dry cleaning place becomes holy. I had every right and authority to declare the White House as holy ground because I was standing there, and where I stand is holy.
Clip from Paula White, otherwise known as Paula White-Caine, President Donald Trump's spiritual advisor and the current director of the White House Faith Office, who was explaining how the Holy Spirit works through her. Neil and I are going to be talking about that a little bit more today. This is the Don't Stop Believin' episode of the Political Junkie podcast. I'm Claire Potter.
I'm Neil Young.
And Neil, this one was just like picked out of the hat for you, wasn't it?
I mean, first of all, I have to give you props to the title of this episode, which will clue listeners into a little bit more about why that's just such a perfect title for it. But yeah, I mean, just lob a softball slowly up the middle for me, and I'll try not to hit too many home runs here. Now I've jinxed myself.
This is so exciting. And we're going to get to the news in a minute, but I just wanted to ask you, since this is Religion Day at the Political Junkie podcast, how was your Easter?
It was great. We went to an early church service and then spent the day down in Newport Beach, where it was absolutely gorgeous. I have to say, spent my whole life going to church, been to literally thousands of services. Something occurred at this church service I've never seen before in my life, which is, and that is like perfect for me, which is not one, but two different people had their dogs with them at the service.
Really?
Yeah. And I mean, you know how crazy I am about, we take our dog everywhere, but everywhere, but literally had never occurred to me to take a dog to church. And I'm certainly supportive of this.
Well, you know, when we lived in New Haven, there was a particular day in the year, and I can't remember what it was, when you would bring your animals to be blessed, and that was so much fun.
Yeah, St. Francis of Assisi Day, yeah.
So when is that?
I think it's usually done in the spring, like in April, I want to say.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's like a regular event, right? Especially at sort of high church denominations. But no, these were like two different women with like, you know, little foo-foo dogs that were, I mean, this was, I should say it was in Beverly Hills, so, you know.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. Well, that's exciting. You know, our Easter was nowhere near as exciting. It was actually getting cold here again. Nevertheless, I struggled out to the garden and did what I do every Easter, which is get in as many seeds as possible. My idea about Easter is to just celebrate the rebirth of everything. And I don't think I've been to church on Easter since we lived in New York, when I used to go up to St. John the Divine. Did you ever go to Easter service there?
I never went to Easter service there, but I can imagine what an amazing place it must have been to experience the service.
It's incredible. It's incredible. And then there's a certain point in the service where they like throw open the eastern door and just let the sun in, and everybody, all the religious walk in, and it's just stunning. And anyway, all right. So here we are in spring, Neil, and let's get to the news. On Monday, in a Truth Social post, Donald Trump threatened Iran with annihilation, a truly shocking development that was roundly rebuked not just by Archbishop Paul S. Coakley of Oklahoma City, who's president of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, but by Pope Leo XIV himself. What is it that Cooley and the Pope said to Donald Trump?
I mean, that this was basically beyond the pale of what any leader should say, that this was immoral. I don't think they used the word anti-Christian, but I mean, I think that was sort of in the sentiment as well, that this is not what any leader can do, and certainly not someone who leads this nation. A complete, condemnation of the statement. And I think, again, they were not the only ones making this, but it was, I think, particularly pointed, given this was Easter Monday. And Easter Sunday, Trump had sent out that tweet that was crazy, right, where he said, "Praise be to Allah," and I think he used the F word as well, right?
Yep.
And sort of teeing up the destruction language that he used the next day.
Yeah, and this is a sort of long lob to our news focus today, but, there's been a lot coming out of the White House sort of replicating the valorization of the Crusades on the Christian right. Pete Hegseth seems to be treating this like a crusade. I think he has something crusadery tattooed on his chest.
Yeah.
And, all of these evangelical Christians seem to be forgetting that actually the Crusades are a Catholic project. They were not a Protestant project at all. And I loved it that the Pope said in his Palm Sunday homily, which was now over 10 days ago, that God doesn't listen to the prayers of those who wage war, but rejects them. And it made me think a lot of Bartolome de las Casas, who, if listeners don't know him, he is the priest who went to Mexico long after the conquest of Mexico was underway and saw the number of indigenous people who had been murdered and were being enslaved and so on. And he wrote a kind of blistering rebuttal to the whole project, which was undertaken in the name of the King of Spain and the Pope and the Holy Roman Empire. And so it made me think not just that Leo and the bishops that were put in place by his predecessors are really good people, but that they are reviving a tradition in the church that is counter to everything this administration wants religion to be.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point you made about sort of evangelicals forgetting that it was Catholics who carried out the Crusades, because if you think back not that long ago to, a moment in which evangelical anti-Catholicism was a really prominent feature of American life. I mean, I would say most of the 20th century and certainly, the 19th century, the Crusades was one of the first examples they held up of sort of the Catholic Church being an unchristian or a heretical institution, one that was more interested in power and territory than it was in the gospel. And so, the sort of evangelical anti-Catholicism has really gone away, or is dramatically transformed in recent decades. But it is a really wild thing for someone like Hegseth to invoke and to be sort of taken up by.
Yeah. Well, and this is something I don't understand at all. Maybe you've read a little bit more about it. This Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, this guy Elbridge Colby, then summons Cardinal Christophe Pierre, the Vatican's U.S. representative, and seemed to be threatening the Pope with a military reprisal. What was going on with that, Neil?
Yeah, I mean, he seemed to be doing exactly that. And then the thing that was quoted from him that was in the piece we read, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it was something along the lines of, the U.S. has the power to do anything it wants to in the world, and the Catholic Church better get on board with that. That is a astounding statement to make. For many, many reasons, but especially in the context of the Catholic Church should get on the side of uncontrolled power, right? Power that can't be constrained. I mean, we have just war theory, right? The Catholic Church developed a whole theology that was enormously influential on, military history for a very long time in terms of like what are just wars that are waged. And it's in absolute opposition to that sort of position that like, might makes right, and a power that's able to do anything it wants, including like obliterate this world, should be able to do it. I mean, it's wild. And that all of this again was happening around Easter weekend seems particularly pointed.
And it's horrifying that there isn't anybody around Donald Trump who says this is completely and totally insane. I mean, instead, there are all these people that are on board. One of the things that I was sort of mildly impressed by was that Elbridge Colby mentioned the Avignon Pope, which, since this is like Know Your Early Modern History Day at the Political Junkie Substack, the Avignon Pope was a pope that the King of France actually went and kidnapped in like, the 14th century or something like that. And they hung on to the Pope and kept the Pope in Avignon. Meanwhile, the cardinals then go and elect another Pope. So there's actually a rather long period where there are two popes. And then eventually the Avignon thing peters out. But Colby seemed to be also suggesting like we could come and grab you like we grabbed Nicolas Maduro, which also seemed bananas.
I mean, can you imagine such a thing being done? That truly can't be in the realm of possibility. But like the fact that these are the terms, or these are the sort of ways that Trump administration officials speak and communicate with the world, is crazy. I mean, if you have the commander in chief putting out tweets about the annihilation of a civilization, then I suppose it's not all that surprising to hear something like this from a policy guy in he's in the Department of Defense, correct?
Yeah, he's an undersecretary of defense or an undersecretary of war or whatever the hell they call them nowadays. Right. I mean, it's just crazy. All right, well, let's get back to the good news. In the category of even when Democrats lose, they win, voters in Georgia 14 went to the polls on Tuesday to elect a replacement for Marjorie Taylor Greene. Now, this was just like a slam dunk, right, Neil? But not so much. Why don't you tell our listeners?
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of remarkable because, the guy who won, this guy, Trump, he's a Trump-backed Republican, Clay Fuller, 54% of the vote. Obviously, that's a good, healthy win. But it was really remarkable given that this district is one of the reddest there is in the nation. I mean, Trump won it by, plus 37
right.
in 2024. This is so a huge gain for the Democratic candidate there. And I think just a lot of Republicans I saw on Twitter, sort of Republicans who don't have their heads completely in the sand, were pointing this race out and just saying, wow, like we've got a lot to worry about here. If this district, this Republican is only winning by this sort of margin here. We've been talking again and again about Democratic victories, or in this case, a slim Republican victory and what we think it means for the midterms. But this is, I think, one of the maybe most stunning developments we've talked about in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, and if you look at Georgia 14, it's one of those districts where they have pulled out a little chunk of Democratic voters from a solid blue district. And they're like overwhelmed by these other counties that are either ruby red or bright pink. And Republicans had to spend $1.5 million on a seat that is normally a gimme. And that, by the way, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's one of the best fundraisers in the Republican Party, didn't actually ever need any money to win because she had so much in her war chest. We will say the Democrat, Harris, spent about the same amount of money. However, he still has $750,000 cash on hand, which he's going to need because he's going to run again in the fall. So this was like a replacement seat, and everybody has to run again in 6 months.
Yeah. I mean, do we think that this is are we wrong to be drawing the speculations that we are about, or the predictions that we are about the midterms from these recent races? I mean, it seems to be queuing up big Democratic wins in the fall, but there's a lot of time between now and then. And also, I'm, who knows what the Trump administration is about to pull out.
Well, okay, so I bet there are a lot of political consultants who are jumping in and crunching the data. It is difficult to predict anything from an off-cycle election. That is true, because people are often not aware of the off-cycle election. They often don't know much about the person who is running. They stay home. It does show that Democrats are activated, and for some reason, Republicans are less activated. And that's the pattern we're seeing over and over again. And if you get the Cook Political Report Substack, as I do, you would see that there are 6 seats that they have changed status on, only one of which they have moved into the Republican column, 3 of which they have moved into the Democratic column, and 3 of which they have moved from likely Republican to toss-up.
Wow.
So there is something that is being documented out there that is changing. I would also, and this is pure speculation on my part, but I'm going to start watching for it in our reading. Georgia is a very military state. The perception that people in the military just happily run off to fight whatever war they're being asked to fight without asking any questions about it or caring about it, I think is absolutely wrong. And I think while we're not going to see fatal shifts against Trump in the military vote, I think we're going to see a softening of the military vote for Trump and Trump candidates.
I think that's right.
So better and better and better. In other election news, Wisconsin Democrats have snagged another state Supreme Court seat, and it was a cakewalk. Chris Taylor won by 17 points, giving liberals a solid 5-2 majority on the Wisconsin State Supreme Court. Neil, it wasn't that far in the past that Wisconsin, all eyes were on their Supreme Court, and now the Republicans seem to have tacoed.
Yeah, and also that Wisconsin seemed like, not that it was becoming red, but it was becoming sort of pink. I mean, it's a place that are, purple, I suppose, right?
Yep.
That a lot of, both parties were putting a lot of attention on and spending a lot there.
Yep.
It seems to have moved fully back into the blue camp around these, certainly this is a big statement for voters to, go to the polls and to ensure that the Supreme Court had this 5-2 liberal majority. I mean, that seems a pretty important, development. The GOP also didn't spend hardly any money on this race. So I think that's not insignificant, but I think that's not because, I think that's not what led to the result as much as it was sort of a sign that they knew they weren't going to win.
Yep.
But there's also some other results from Wisconsin that are pretty interesting too, right?
Oh, yes. Back to the mayor's races. The real shocker is in Waukesha County, which is 86% white, very wealthy, and a traditional Republican bastion outside Milwaukee. And there are these collar counties around Milwaukee that are called the WOW counties, Waukesha being one of them, and then another one starts with an O and another one starts with a W. And they have always traditionally balanced out the very Democratic vote in Milwaukee. Well, Democrat Alicia Halvensleben defeated incumbent Waukesha Mayor Scott Allen with 51.2% of the vote. Trump won Waukesha County by 20 points in 2024. That is a huge result, Neil, don't you think?
It is. I have a question. Is it Waukesha or Waukesha? I feel like there's probably people screaming right now.
I know.
But in any event, yes,
Could be Waukesha.
Yeah, I think it might be. Trump won by 20 points. This woman, the Democratic candidate, it's a close victory, but certainly, again, given how Republican this county is, it's just like another example. I mean, I think this is sort of similar to some of the mayoral races we were seeing in South Florida. In Republican, sort of Republican safe districts who've won in the last year. I mean, there seems to be a consistent pattern. that we've watched over the last 3 to 6 months. Let's hope that pattern remains for a while.
Well, and here's, as long as I'm, rife with speculation today, one of the things I've been thinking about is that there's all this culture wars rhetoric coming out of Washington and some very heavy-handed stuff that has happened around withdrawing money from various, DEI initiatives, gender initiatives, racial initiatives, and so on. Your mayor is the person who probably has the most influence locally on education, on taxes, on the police, on how people are treated. And one of the things I'm starting to wonder is whether, in fact, these very Republican places are staunchly against what Trump is doing, particularly on immigration. And his polling on immigration is way down. And I'm wondering, are all of these Republicans saying what we need to do is elect a mayor who's going to stand between us and him? Or again, is it just Republicans staying home and Democrats getting out there?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, like, having not looked at this race or closely and not knowing what sort of the campaign looked like, but I do think in general, you can see a trend in a lot of races, whether mayoral or some of the other congressional seats we've looked at, where, and I think a lot of voters also know, like, that their representative, like, really shapes life in the district they live in important ways too, where you have Republican candidates who basically, like, their campaign is just total, fealty to Trump. And the Democratic candidate is like, here are the policy things I want to deliver for you. And there's just a real disconnect between sort of the conversations both candidates are leading. And in a moment in which people, see prices going up, where, the pocketbook issues are really paramount, where, the escalation of, like, these of war in the Middle East and just like the handling of immigration, as you just said, where folks just really don't like where they see the direction of the country going as led by the Trump administration, to have a candidate saying, I'm going to fix those things, and my commitment is to lower your grocery prices, like, not entangle the country in needless wars, that just really connects with a lot of voters, understandably.
Yeah, I think that's right. All right, so back to Washington, D.C., Pam Bondi, who was subpoenaed to appear before the House Oversight Committee on April 14th to testify about the Epstein case, but the Department of Justice has notified the committee that she won't be coming, as she is no longer Attorney General Barbie. Puzzled members of the House Oversight Committee, including some Republicans, say she still has to show up. Committee Chair James Comer says, well, he doesn't know how to withdraw a subpoena, so maybe someone can help him with that. The acting Attorney General, which is Todd Blanche, says that's up to James Comer to figure out, not him. So what's going on here? Do you want to lay a bet on whether Pam Bondi's going to show up on August 14th?
I'm going to bet she doesn't. I mean...
Okay, I'm going to bet she does, just because you're betting she doesn't.
One of us will be right.
Okay, why do you think she won't?
Well, it just seems in keeping with what the Trump folks in the Trump administration do, which is like nothing applies to them. No rules has to be followed, etc. I mean, I love the logic of this. Like, she doesn't have to appear because she's no longer Attorney General. Like, oh, that's a great get out of jail free, right? Like,
right.
Certainly,
I mean, Hillary Clinton was no longer First Lady either, but she had to show up.
Yes, I was just going to say, this didn't seem to apply to the Clintons, who haven't, been around for a really, really long time. Pam Bondi's only been out of the office for, a week or two. There was reporting that, she, like, burst into tears when Trump fired her. Have you read these accounts? That it was very, very emotional. I have, and it makes me
so happy. It makes me just so happy, Neil.
Sorry, this is, I think, the definition of schadenfreude, but...
Yeah.
But I think some of the reporting around that was that a lot of the emotion was about, concern about not having the protection of the administration around her if she was no longer. But apparently that wasn't an issue at all, because they're concocting these crazy, defenses that, like, she doesn't have to do this because she's out of the job.
Well, my third round of speculation in this short period of time that we've been together today is that actually they fired her when they did because she was supposed to testify. and that this was the only thing they could think of to pull her out. But all right, I'm going to try and make an argument for why she will show up. She's such a bitch. And I'm sorry, that was not a nice thing to say, but I believe it. And I think it is factually true. And I think she probably is not the kind of person that wants to go out on a whimper. And I can see her showing up and really just like letting it all hang out. Can't you?
Well, maybe with a sort of different analytical lens on this than the one you provided, although I don't think you're wrong. She is a complete, like spotlight grabber, loves the fame, loves the attention. I think you're right. Like there's a way to go before the committee on April 14th and like actually not answer any of the questions, but to do so in a way that's about like conservative grievance and grandstanding that like really plays well with the conservative media base. So yeah, I think there's a way to actually that maybe an appearance like this sort of like redeems her and gives her a way of sort of closing this story differently than, than it being that she was fired. Like she gets to go, she gets to grandstand, she gets to put her nose up in the air and be haughty about it all and rebuke the questioners for daring to ask questions. And those are the clips that play great with the base, right?
Right. No, that's absolutely right. The 14th is a Tuesday, right?
Yeah, it is.
All right.
Tuesday.
See you next Tuesday, Pam Bondi. So let's go to our news focus, Neil. Paula White-Caine and what she teaches us about Donald Trump's Christian nationalism. Now, this is her legal name, Paula White-Caine, but we're going to call her Paula White because pretty much everybody does, right, Neil?
That's right. I think, this add-on of Caine is from a marriage that hasn't been the case for that long. She became famous as Paula White. Certainly what I think of in my head when I think about her.
Okay, so before we jump into Paula, let's sort of create the context for why we've been thinking about this. And one is, in particular, this idea of the war in Iran as a Christian crusade. We were talking about that earlier. On Easter Monday, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth compared the downed pilot who was briefly lost in Iran. He was rescued by special forces. And Hegseth compared him to Jesus Christ. All right, let's take a look at that film for just a second. Okay.
The Iranians are still asking themselves right now, how did the Americans do this? One downed airman evaded capture for more than a day, scaling rugged ridges while hunted by the enemy. When he was finally able to activate his emergency transponder, his first message was simple. And it was powerful. He sent a message, God is good. In that moment of isolation and danger, his faith and fighting spirit shone through. You see, shot down on a Friday, Good Friday, hidden in a cave, a crevice, all of Saturday, and rescued on Sunday. Flown out of Iran as the sun was rising on Easter Sunday. A pilot reborn, all home and accounted for, a nation rejoicing. God is good.
Okay, Neil, what was that about?
I mean, if anyone say if someone in the Obama administration had done this, I mean, the outcry on Fox News about how this was like heretical and, slander, to the person of Jesus Christ would be nonstop. But Hegseth is really sort of driven by this like sort of messianic Christian nationalist like framing of everything. It's still really wild to me to compare like an earthly person to Jesus around Easter weekend again.
Right.
It's wild. I think it underscores the point you made a little bit earlier about Hegseth's particular way in which he sees and I think articulates American foreign policy through this very like religious framework and really an apocalyptic framework as well. So scary that this is sort of the worldview that is driving this guy, because it seems even more unhinged than this is not sort of textbook conservative evangelicalism. Right. It's something that's like really supercharged. And he's the Secretary of Defense.
Yeah, exactly. But, one of the things that made me think about, and I'm just sort of turning this over in my head as we were doing our readings for today, was how unbelievably personal and immediate this brand of evangelicism is. And that Paula White, who is Donald Trump's spiritual advisor and has been his spiritual advisor for 20 years, and we'll get into that, but the extent to which perhaps this administration is saying things that other people might have thought or dreamed about or prayed on, but it's now all out in public. And watching Paula White preach, and we began with a clip of her preaching, we're going to have another clip of her later, really made me think about how present they make God, and that there is this deep personal, immediate relationship with the spiritual that you don't really see in a lot of other religions. Am I overstating it, Neil?
No, I think you're putting your finger on something that's distinctive here. I mean, evangelical Christianity preaches a, active, engaged, God who is directing, the developments of the world, and that believers can connect themselves to that through prayer and through their own relationship with the divine, and that part of the Christian's duty is to bring God's will to pass on earth. And so that can be interpreted in a million different ways, which is what gives us the history of American Christianity and the sort of factionalism of American Protestantism, right? Like Lutherans have interpreted that very differently than Pentecostal, on and on and on. But I think the particular figures who have coalesced around Trump have this theology of Christian nationalism, which takes sort of basic Christian principles or basic evangelical principles about, a close relationship with God and a God who directs the course of the world, and hypercharged it in a very particular American militaristic context. And also, I think a lot of them believe that they're bringing about the end days.
And that God is working through Donald Trump. And,
right.
That's one of the, and of course you see this on X and you see people talking about it casually. It almost seems like a meme. But when you start paying attention to someone like Paula White, you see that there is actually somebody in the West Wing who is promoting a worldview for Trump that absolutely buttresses his narcissism and egomania, with the sense that actually that narcissism and egomania are God's will speaking through him. So I just want to say for our listening audience that we have not lost our mind. We know the First Amendment to the Constitution prohibits establishing a national religion. However, Project 2025, in fact, sort of dismissed that aspect of the Constitution and promoted the strengthening of Christianity and biblical principles across the federal government and throughout civic life. We're really beginning to see that kind of promotion through the government, are we not?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that, the Trump administration has a lot of people in prominent positions who are carrying out the work of Project 2025 and this sort of, as you just said, this goal to strengthen like Christian principle, or I wouldn't even say principles as much as just sort of Christian identity, Christian imagery, sort of Christianity as a political force across the federal government and through civic life. Just in terms of the First Amendment to the Constitution and the separation of, there's a long history here of particular conservative activists who've spent their lives, making the argument and sort of being activists around, dispensing with this notion about the separation of church and state. And one of the favorite things they say is, that language is not actually in the Constitution, because of course that language comes from a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote. But as you point out, the First Amendment itself, although it doesn't use those explicit words, that's what its message is.
Right.
That's what it establishes. So yeah, but I mean, there's been, this is a decades-long project that really seems to be culminating in this particular administration.
Yeah, and just to be clear, listeners, what the Establishment Clause in the First Amendment says is that there shall be no established state religion. And I think that does sort of offer a little wormhole for people to come in and say, well, it's not saying we can't have any religion. It says the state cannot establish a religion. But to the extent that the state has tools to establish a religion, in other words, the education system. We've seen a lot of evangelical activity in the military. We've seen evangelical activity across the federal bureaucracy. We've seen for some time that there are congressional groups that are organized around prayer and faith and so on. And on a certain level, so what? Because people have a right to their faith. On the other hand, these lines have been blurring for a while. Neil, just sort of give us a capsule history of religion in the White House. Has religion always been in the White House?
Well, I'm sure that most people who've had the office of the presidency have had some religious faith as a part of their life. So in that way, we could say yes, it's probably always been there in different ways and different flavors. But I think what you're asking about maybe is sort of the visibility and prominence of it as a public, as a public expression. And I think that is really a sort of mid-century phenomenon that we can sort of pinpoint around the Cold War, America, particularly the presidency of Dwight Eisenhower, I would say is the starting point of this, right? Mm-hmm. Because he's the first president who has an official spiritual advisor. That spiritual advisor is Billy Graham. Billy Graham then becomes sort of the de facto spiritual advisor of the White House because he had relationships with 13 presidents, right?
Right.
Pretty much across the 20th century and into the 21st century, all the way to Barack Obama. Billy Graham sort of believed that it was his calling to provide spiritual advising, as the presidents wanted, to anyone who was in the office, that this was not a partisan project, but, a spiritual one. And so I think that is obviously a real transformation, but one that sort of fits with the broader visibility of religion in American public life that we see happening in the mid 20th century, and that, has sort of different expressions over the following decades.
Yeah. And then one of the things we need to come back to is that Billy Graham is, of course, a Protestant. He's an evangelical. I was actually thinking a lot about the extent to which evangelicism is in many ways a very populist religion and functions as a populist religion. I mean, the Billy Graham crusade, one of the things they would do is he wouldn't go to a city unless he was called to come to that city. So how did he get called to come? They would start these prayer groups, and it was mostly women, and women who would gather and pray for Billy Graham to come. And then when he felt called, and then, of course, you might cynically say when he had a big enough audience and there were enough prayer groups going, he would then come. But there is this sort of sense of populism in evangelicism, whereas Catholicism was a huge issue for voters in 1960. And there's this great moment when John F. Kennedy, who's running for president in September 1960, goes to a group of Protestant pastors in Houston and says, and he was being criticized because people said, well, if the Pope tells you to do something, you will, which is typical American. And he says, I'm absolutely in favor of the separation of church and state, and I oppose any kind of religious discrimination against anyone. He said, I'm not the Catholic candidate for president, but the Democratic Party's candidate for president who happens also to be Catholic. I do not speak for my church on public matters, and the church does not speak for me. And if you fast forward, Joe Biden is doing the same thing. I mean, Joe Biden, who said he was privately against abortion, but that he would not create policies to limit other people's right for abortion. So being religious is not actually always a good thing if you're a president. Being Protestant it seems to me, has been.
Well, it's been certainly a hurdle that Catholic candidates have had to overcome that Protestants have not. I mean, obviously in 1960, it was a really, really big issue, a really divisive issue. It's sort of, I've written a lot about the 1960 campaign and the anti-Catholicism of it and what the Kennedy team had to do to overcome it. And of course, this was a different moment in American history where there was still a lot of very public anti-Catholicism that was part of like American culture. And, you know, you look back at the articles and the pamphlets that were written at the time, and it was all this stuff about the Pope was going to have a direct line to the White House, and he was going to be able to, like, you know, direct foreign policy or direct American policy. And also that this would mean that like all the federal dollars would be going into Catholic churches and to Catholic hospitals and to the Catholic, you know, and to Catholic schools. It's interesting to think about that when eventually what we have are the development of things like the Office of Faith and, you know, the George W. Bush administration, which basically is, and I'm not getting the title of that. It was do you remember the exact name of the office?
The Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives.
Right, which was basically created to make it sort of easier for faith-based organizations to have access to federal grants, right? To sort of help facilitate them, sort of put them on a level playing field with, you know, non-religious organizations, but to basically allow them to access to federal money, you know, through a sort of streamlined process and one that had, you know, the help of the White House. Again, you know, the concern was Kennedy gets elected and like all of our tax dollars are going straight into Catholic schools. So the conversation shifted. Obviously, American Protestants are less anti-Catholic than they were in the 1950s and 1960s. But, you know, if anything, I think Biden was often criticized for not being Catholic enough, at least criticized by, you know, people on the right.
Yeah. And, you know, one of the things that we also see is that being involved with a politician is not always good for a minister. And there are a couple examples of that. One is Billy Graham, who actually ends up sort of humiliated and rebuked when Richard Nixon goes down in Watergate, because he defended Nixon till the very end. He and Nixon were very, very close. And that sort of touched on this whole question of whether evangelicals should be in politics at all. And we really have to see Republican operatives talking evangelicals back onto the political stage in 1979 after Billy Graham takes such a hit to his reputation. But then also, again, fast forward, Barack Obama, who was very close to his own pastor, the Reverend Jeremiah Wright, whose, you know, a number of his speeches came out and his sermons in which he's highly critical of the United States government, highly critical of white people, has a lot of very harsh things to say about racism in America. And Obama was forced to, you know, send him into exile, basically. So it's tricky. Being religious or having a religious advisor doesn't always help.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think the real controversy with Jeremiah Wright was, what was the famous quote? Something about chickens coming home to roost that was, you know,
around 9/11, I think.
9/11, right?
Yeah.
You know, Obama had to completely disavow him and disavow those statements, which I don't think were hard for him to do, but like basically to completely publicly cut ties with him, as you just said. You know, I think it just demonstrates that a lot of times when we're talking about religion in American public life, what we're really talking about is white evangelical Christianity and how that's sort of the norm and or maybe not the norm, but the standard in terms of the sort of expectation of what religious faith is supposed to look like, especially when expressed in the political realm.
Yeah. All right. So let's get to Paula White, who the nation really first met, at least the nation outside her televangelical ministry, met in 2017 when she delivered the invocation at the inauguration. She was the first female clergy member to speak at that ceremony, which is really, I was about to say it's really astonishing, but it really isn't astonishing. Yeah. In 2025, she appeared on PBS's Frontline to discuss a relationship with Donald Trump that goes back 20 years. Neil, can you tell our listeners a little bit about Paula White and how she got involved with Trump.
Yeah, I mean, Paula White, she grew up in Mississippi. She came from, as she describes over and over again, a sort of very dysfunctional home. She says that I believe it was her father sexually abused her as she was growing up, that she had just like, as she says over and over again, like a lot of dysfunction and brokenness in her life. She says that she had an encounter with Jesus in, I believe when she was like 18 years old, which was like in 1984. Then she started launching her ministry in the 90s. And it's been controversial from the start, in part because of like the particular message or the particular, I think, gospel she preaches, which is often considered prosperity gospel. So this idea that, shows his favor through material wealth, and that one also shows their devotion to God by tithing a lot to, the particular ministries that they support, which of course really benefits the person in charge of that ministry. Yeah. So she has said that she doesn't preach the prosperity gospel. I think like if you look at her sermons, if you read them, you watch them, they seem to be of that ilk. 3 marriages, sort of ministries that have come and gone, investigations around her financial dealings, lots of sort of accusations of fraud and sort of embezzlement and sort of other financial misdealings within her ministry. What else should we talk about when it comes to Paula White?
Well, let's see. I would say there are 2 things that are important. One of them is very small. She's currently married to a guy named Jonathan Cain of the rock band Journey, who everyone knows his work because he played those iconic opening bars of Don't Stop Believing, which I don't think I'll ever be able to listen to again in the same way now that I've learned that. But the other thing that I think is interesting about her is that she is a televangelist. And one of the things we know about Donald Trump is that he watches television obsessively. And Paula White was on, I think, 9 different networks in Florida. So she was being broadcast all over Florida and all over the South. And apparently he was watching her. And she was in New York one day. We watched that great Frontline interview with her. She was in New York and he called her and he said, I want you to come to Trump Tower. And she goes to Trump Tower. Now, one of the things I also learned, because one of those investigations was a 2007 Senate investigation. Okay, so this is a Bush administration investigation into Paula White, which the Senate doesn't investigate unless they think something really bad is going on. And one of the investigators apparently called her church, which was called what? Something Without Walls. A Ponzi scheme, and that there were an enormous number of things being sold to parishioners. And at one point she went on television and urged them to send their first paycheck of the year to her. And then she said, she hadn't really done that, but she actually did. But what strikes me as important about this is she meets Trump 20 years ago in Trump Tower. She now owns an apartment in Trump Tower. She paid $3.5 million for it. It's probably worth at least 3 times that now. So there's a lot of money sloshing around here. And it made me think Donald Trump and Paula White are kind of the same person on a certain level. And I wonder if you see that too.
I was thinking the same as I was spending a lot of, especially in watching the Frontline documentary, which is like, or the Frontline interview, which is quite intriguing, I think. I mean, it's sort of fascinating to hear her tell the story of their relationship. And if you think about both of them, I mean, the sort of obvious thing is the obsession with media, both watching it constantly and being on it constantly. And the sense that like television is like where reality is created, right? Like that is the place in which like the world is made. I think that there's something that really connects the 2 of them there. There's also, I mean, she is sort of, in a lot of ways, it's not surprising that he's drawn to her, right? Because she's attractive, she's white, she looks like a Fox News host, and we know how much he cares about aesthetics. She also is a complete supporter of him and has been for 20 plus years, and he loves that. And one who sort of, I was really struck in the Frontline documentary or interview, how any And I didn't even think the questions were hard hitting, but any question that was just sort of like, can you explain this to us? Because people don't really understand this about Trump. She turned every single, question about him into an opportunity to sort of rewrite his biography in real time.
Yes.
And in a way
Yes.
that just like completely, puffs him up, which is exactly what he does. So I think probably he saw in her, and she maybe saw in him, that quality and that opportunity, and what that might mean for both of them.
I think that's absolutely right. And she has a very winning self-presentation.
Completely.
And it's quite different from her preaching.
Yeah.
I mean, they're really two totally different personalities for two totally different audiences. And of course, Trump can do that too.
Yeah.
And actually, listeners, let's go briefly to a little piece of tape. This is later in the sermon that we started with, in which Paula White is speaking in tongues, which is otherwise known as glossolalia.
Angels are being released right now. Angels are being dispatched right now. Hamanda aka ata raka teda baka sanda ata ambo osa kata rite eke banda ata rike didi ashata. For angels have even been dispatched from Africa right now. Africa right now. Africa right now. From Africa right now.
That's kind of astonishing, Neil.
It is. And if I feel like that's the type of content that I see regularly when it comes to Paula White. Like that's
right.
Those are the clips that have, provided my ideas of who and what Paula White is. And so obviously, like, that's how she leads her ministry, and that's how she preaches and how she performs as a religious leader, given all that context and all those clips I've watched of her through the years, and that sort of representation of her. It was really sort of jarring to watch the Frontline interview where she's so polished and controlled and like really sort of sober-minded and like a good storyteller, but in a way that like felt pretty believable. It just was, and obviously there's like a chameleon-like quality to this, which I think is what you're also saying about Trump. And to some extent, this is what every politician does, right? You speak, or any like public figure, you sort of address the audience you have at hand. But it's really sort of jarring to have those clips of her sort of religious prophecy and her charismatic praying and her speaking in tongues, and then this very sort of like, PBS style back and forth interview on Frontline.
So I just want to assure you listeners that Neil and I take this seriously. We do not make fun of anybody's faith or how they practice their faith. But I think what we're trying to point to here is the ability to code switch to different audiences. So we're linking to the Frontline interview. What you will see is the nice Christian lady next door who will probably show up with a casserole anytime you need one, which is not the sort of power and energy that she is displaying on the stage when inhabited by the Holy Spirit. White, has also been criticized for her political involvement, not just for the various scandals surrounding her. She's been investigated for diverting funds and profits from the sale of religious items into her own pockets, into those of family members. There's a private plane. Again, there's a kind of pattern here of a person of relatively modest origins becoming a minister of a far-flung ministry of millions and becoming an extremely wealthy person. And again, you got to think Trump really admires that about her.
Absolutely. I mean, what does he love more than someone who gets rich?
Right.
And so I think, he loves that sort of, personal arc of someone's life. I think both Paula White and Donald Trump believe that wealth is a sign of divine favor. And so it's sort of reinforcing of like how they see each other as special. Like they see each other as special in part because like they've made a lot of money, and in their worldview, that again connotes a special blessing from God. I also think, like, we keep saying there's been a lot of criticism of Paula White, and certainly there has been, but it's worth just sort of making it explicit that that criticism isn't coming solely from, say, secular media or like the left. That a lot of the criticism, and I would say the criticism that has the longest history, because they've been watching this for the longest period of time, is from conservative evangelicals, because where it's like might be a little bit confusing to a lot of listeners, but what we would refer to, or what I would refer to as sort of quote unquote mainstream evangelicals, see the prosperity gospel and see someone like Paula White as heretical, as someone who's not truly a Christian, because it's not, it stands outside sort of quote unquote normal evangelical theology. And so it's just sort of worth understanding that when the talk is around the criticism of White, that a lot of it is coming from the types of people and the types of circles that are also big supporters of Trump himself.
Yeah, it's very complicated.
Yeah, but have a real religious objection to like who White is and what she represents.
And then there's a whole subset of that group who thinks she shouldn't be preaching at all because she's a woman.
Right, exactly. Which is part of it, but not solely not the only reason why they object to her, but certainly part of it. Yeah.
So Paula White was around throughout the first administration. She was part of a group, a sort of board that Trump assembled, an advisory board to the Trump campaign, which was mostly white, although not entirely white. And she joined the Trump administration itself in 2019 to run something called the Faith and Opportunity Administration. Again, it's like this effort to channel federal funds through religious organizations. And again, just a little footnote to that. There are a lot of religious organizations that do a lot of really, really great work and ought to be funded. But there is something going on in conservatism where the only appropriate way to do social work is to do it through religious organizations. So that's really where the Bush administration was going. That's where the Trump administration was going. Where things start to get a little gnarly with White is that she speaks on January 5th. She preaches to her crowd. That's where the speaking in tongues comes from that we played earlier. And then she spoke at Trump's January 6th Save America rally, which preceded the attack on the Capitol. And it's that attack when Americans really see the role that Christian nationalism is playing in this very violent part of the Republican Party, right?
Yeah, and I mean, it's in multiple ways. I mean, one is in just the very visible religious iconography that so many of those rioters carried with them, right? There were signs like of sort of crusade actually imagery that was carried, but also signs that were like, Jesus is my savior, Trump is my president, or other, large crosses, but often large crosses with sort of militaristic imagery around them as well. So it was really visible in the riot itself on the Capitol. And of course, it was supercharged, I think, with this sense among many, certainly not all of them, but many of them, that they were carrying out a religious mission, one that seemed to be blessed by some folks that were quite close to the president himself.
Yeah. And so when Trump comes back to the White House after this whole thing happens, he creates something called the White House Faith Office. Now, this is actually different from what George W. Bush did and what Barack Obama continued, which is to have an office that links faith organizations to federal money, which was actually often quite useful. I mean, the distribution of HIV drugs in Africa happens through Christian evangelical networks primarily, and it works very, very well. But this is kind of different. The White House Faith Office is right in the West Wing, and so we're beginning to see a lot of pictures of Paula White with the president. There's one that we'll put in the video, and it's also on the Substack. It's actually kind of iconographic now, which is all of these ministers standing around Donald Trump with their hands on him while everybody's praying. But this is where I wanted to end, at least temporarily. We may have to take this up in another episode, Neil. But it seems to me that in some ways, Paula White is doing the work that a first lady would ordinarily do, which is that she is revealing Donald Trump's inner life, or what she claims to be his inner life, to voters in a way that normally you hear that kind of thing from the president himself, or you hear that kind of thing from the first lady, from family members and so on. But both in the Frontline interview and in her appearance on Lara Trump's Fox News show during Holy Week, she has talked extensively about how religious Donald Trump is, how he went to church all the time growing up. She talks in the Frontline video about his adulation for Norman Vincent Peale, who ran a church in Lower Manhattan. So, Neil, she's playing another kind of role entirely. On the one hand, she is keeping the project of Christianizing the government moving. But on the other hand, she's really doing a lot of public relations for Donald Trump, right?
Really like this idea. I think you should actually pitch this as an article, that Paula White is actually our, the Trump administration's first lady. Yeah, you're right, because she speaks about him biographically in a way I've never heard Melania. Yeah. I mean, have we heard that much from Melania to begin with? Does Melania know these things? Does she care? Would she ever speak to them? No, but the detail with which Paula White has constructed a very particular biography, I would say a very particular religious biography for public consumption, is really striking to me, because, as you said, it's usually the candidate himself, the person himself and his family members who are the message, who carry that message, who make that message in public. And again, I have obviously a ton of thoughts around this and about, Donald Trump as a religious man, but it's sort of fascinating and really entertaining to watch what Paula White's doing, because it feels like one of those college students who's picking out the 5 pieces of evidence they've found and just telling you them again and again and making mountains out of those molehills. I mean, it's he went to church 3 times. You're kidding me. Someone in 1950s America went to church 3 times a week. I am shocked to hear that, right? But she says that over and over again.
Right. And she says he attended Sunday and Saturday school at least 3 times a week. Presbyterians do not have Saturday school.
No, that doesn't exist. And
he grew up Presbyterian.
Yeah. Now, did they go to some activity on a Saturday afternoon at church that has somehow lodged in his mind as something that then, that seems pretty consistent with what, the way Trump tells stories. But most of this is being made up, and the stuff that's not being made up is being as I said, made into mountains. Also, what she's describing is religion and religiosity, which is what evangelicals say is not actually real faith.
Right.
And I think it's been interesting to watch Franklin Graham recently, which is maybe worth bringing into the conversation. Franklin Graham, the son of Billy Graham,
he had the cocktails around the swimming pool.
No, that's Jerry Falwell. You're thinking of Jerry Falwell Jr. Yeah, this is Franklin Graham, Jerry Falwell Jr., different character. Franklin Graham, the son of Billy Graham, but a very different person than Billy Graham, because Billy Graham was always very, very devoted to never being partisan in public life.
Right.
Franklin Graham has become a complete, Fox News Republican Party activist and a huge supporter of Trump, but who pretty clearly doesn't believe that Trump is actually a Christian. And so he sort of walks this fine line between sort of supporting Trump politically, but also he wrote this letter to Trump. I don't know if you saw this, that was delivered around Easter, basically saying I don't know if you're a Christian, but I invite you to accept the gospel. And so that's quite a different, obviously, public presentation of Trump and his religious faith than the one that, Paula White is giving.
Wow, that's really interesting. Well, Neil, I think we're going to have to come back to this. This is so unbelievably rich. And I think the role of religion in the Trump White House is probably going to feed endless numbers of books in the coming year. But let's keep our eye on it, because I got really interested in Paula White. And I don't think we're finished with her, and I don't think whatever activity she has engaged in her own church, my guess is they have not ceased now that she's in the White House. So let's just keep an eye on her. Neil, what do you want to go viral this week?
All right, what I want to go viral this week is a book that's not even coming out until September, but
But pre-order.
It's a pre-order opportunity. We are at the forefront of all things happening, right?
That's so true.
This is highly, highly relevant to the conversation we've just had this week. So that's partly why I'm bringing this up. But this is the new book coming out from Kristen Kobes-Dumais titled Live, Laugh, Love, The Secret History of White Christian Women and the World They Made. Now, Kristen, first of all, friend, colleague in the world of religion. She's a historian at Calvin University. She wrote this just mega bestseller, at least in the world of nonfiction, that came out in 2020 called Jesus and John Wayne. Probably a book that a lot of people have heard about, a lot of people have read on here because it was like such a big bestseller. That book really was looking at how white evangelicals made Jesus into this like figure and this idol of like rugged masculinity and Christian nationalism. So that book came out in 2020, and in a lot of ways it was sort of just this perfect book for the right moment in which a lot of folks were starting to think about what white Christian nationalism was and how it came to be and how it seemed so different from like the religious faith that they knew. So that's, the book that came out 2020. This new book coming out this September is looking at white Christian womanhood. And she's telling this story that begins in the late 19th century, and really she sort of traces how this new thought, which was this movement that really championed the power of the mind to shape reality. Norman Vincent Peale was certainly a part of that.
Yep.
But how that was particularly directed to millions of Christian women, right? And how it has developed over the course of the 20th century in all sorts of different ways. So through things like mommy blogs and romance novels and Hobby Lobby and craft making and sort of religious art and reality television and how it was marketed as empowerment, and how it was also marketed as a way for Christian women, and I think again it's white Christian women, to sort of demonstrate their faith in public life, but how it in the process like drew them into systems that were really prone to manipulate and abuse them. So she's an incredible writer, an incredible thinker. And I think this book is going to be big. I'm looking at it on the Amazon. It's on Amazon page right now, and it's already like at the top of literally it's the top of the Amazon sales list. So we should all be so fortunate to have the bestseller capabilities that Kristen does. But, it's not even out for 5 months and it's already at the top of the list. But we should help it out. People can pre-order it. And if you haven't already read Jesus and John Wayne, I certainly recommend reading that as well.
That's fantastic. I will order it immediately after jumping off. Like you, Neil, my viral thing today is also kind of hooking back into our news focus, since one of the things I was thinking about Paula White's rendition of who Donald Trump was is the mythography around people like Lincoln and Washington, that there are all these children's books written about their virtues that turn out, of course, to be completely false, including like George Washington cutting down the cherry tree and saying, "I cannot tell a lie." That was just made up out of whole cloth. Well, I sort of think White is doing that with Donald Trump's spiritual life. But what I want to go viral this week is public historian John Garrison Marx's America's 250th is repeating a familiar mistake. It's in Time magazine, and it's about the history of erasure and struggle over slave owning by the founders, and George Washington in particular. Marx has a new book coming out about the mythography around George Washington, but one of the things he talks about is the 1920s, a period that bears some historical similarities to ours. It's a very anti-immigrant, this very sort of fragile prosperity. And it was the 200th anniversary of George Washington's birth. And the officials decided to celebrate it in a way that completely erased slave owning by George Washington. And then W.E.B. Du Bois and Carter Woodson and some other historians decided that they were going to mount counter-programming. And in particular, W.E.B. Du Bois created a pageant, which in the early 20th century was an important theatrical way of conveying history to the masses. And in Du Bois's pageant, George Washington stands in the middle of the stage and reads the names of all the people he enslaved. Marx obviously sees a lot of comparisons to our current moment, in which the Trump administration is doing everything it can to sever the historical tie between the founders and slavery, and in fact to bury slavery in the graveyard of history. And although Marx doesn't say it, and maybe you can't say this kind of thing in Time magazine, I think he's kind of calling out to all of us to mount the kind of counter-programming that Du Bois and Woodson and other African-American scholars did so successfully in the 1920s, and not allowing us to forget, but also urging us to understand the meaning of freedom in the context of slavery, and that is a knotty problem that we are still grappling with, and in fact are grappling with in a different way today, as the Republicans sort of imagine the United States as the apex of Western civilization, and also a state that would flatten the oldest civilization on the planet for no reason whatsoever. So the article is John Garrison Marx's America's 250th is repeating a familiar mistake. It's in Time magazine. I think you can get a couple free articles from them, and I'll be linking to it.
Sounds fantastic.
Yeah, it's really cool. So Neil, another great week has passed. Thank you so much for this conversation, and we're going to have to talk about Paula White again, I think.
There's probably a little bit more to say.
I think so. See you next week, Neil.
All right.
That's it for today's show. Thanks for hanging out with us. Share this podcast with a friend who loves history, politics, and smart conversation. You can follow Neil and me on Threads, Blue Sky, X, TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram. Go to the Political Junkie Substack at clairepotter.substack.com for show notes, more episodes, to leave a comment or question, to subscribe for free, or to support our work for as little as $5 a month. You can also subscribe for free by searching for us on your favorite podcast platform. If you do, please leave a rating and a comment so that other listeners can find us. Our podcast is supported by the New School for Social Research and by paying subscribers. Political Junkie is written, recorded, edited, and produced by me, Claire Potter. Today's theme is Joyful Morning by Cast of Characters. You can find their work and all the talented artists we feature on these episodes on Soundstripe. That's all for now. See you next week.